The trees leaned away from them when they approached. At first, Jonah thought it was a trick of the light, the way the early fog caught on branches, bending them into illogical shapes. But as he stepped forward, he saw it clearly. Each tree recoiled, their trunks curving slightly, roots withdrawing beneath the mossy earth. Leaves shivered though there was no wind, brushing against each other like the hushed murmurs of a crowd trying to stay unseen. He stopped, heart hammering. "Did you see that?" he whispered, and his voice sounded too loud, intrusive, in the sudden unnatural silence. Mara hesitated behind him, scanning the dense forest. "See what?" she asked, but her eyes darted from one tree to another, wide and unsettled. She didn't answer immediately, as if hesitant to admit that she had felt it too. The odd, recoiling pressure that brushed against the back of her mind. The path had been obvious a minute ago, a faint trail of compacted dirt winding through the ferns. But now it seemed to curve, subtly shifting away from them with each step. Jonah bent down, fingers tracing the ground. The dirt was undisturbed, yet somehow wrong, as if the forest had just exhaled and reshaped the path behind them. "Jonah," Mara said, her voice tremulous. "Everything's moving. The path. Look." She pointed, and he realized the trunks were not only bending away, but the branches were arching over themselves in strange geometries, forming impossible angles. The deeper they went, the more distorted the shapes became. The forest was not passive. It was aware, and it was afraid. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. The usual hum of life had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to have been swallowed whole. Jonah tried to whistle, a casual note to break the tension, but it sounded wrong in the hollow, static quiet, bouncing back at him like it had been filtered through layers of unseen branches. He remembered a detail from the map they had studied. A clearing, somewhere in the center, marked as a sacred grove. The symbol had been little more than a circle, simple, unassuming. But now he wondered whether that mark had been a warning, not a destination. The farther they walked, the more they noticed the subtle ways the forest recoiled. Roots shifted beneath the soil as if conscious of their intrusion. Leaves pulled back when fingers brushed near them. Branches trembled with tiny, deliberate motions, tiny nudges, like the brush of invisible hands. He couldn't tell whether the trees were fleeing from them or shielding something from view. Mara's hand found his arm. "I feel like I'm forgetting things," she murmured. I don't remember why we came this way, or if there was even a reason." Her voice shook. The mist seemed to thicken, pressing in like a soft, damp hand on the back of her neck. Jonah's stomach tightened. He, too, struggled to recall the steps that had brought them this deep into the forest. Time became slippery. Minutes stretched and contracted. Jonah thought he had seen a stump a few feet ahead, twisted and gnarled. When he blinked, it was gone. Or perhaps it had never been there. Every landmark felt wrong, fleeting. He began to doubt the solidity of the trees themselves. Were they standing or merely pretending? "You see it too, right?" Mara's whisper trembled between them. Jonah nodded, though words failed him. He could feel the forest's fear as a pressure in his chest. It was not anger that radiated from the trees. It was a protective instinct. Something lay beneath their roots, something the forest shielded in its subtle, unnatural motions. Every gesture, every curve of a branch was a warning. The path split ahead. Two trails that should have been parallel now bent impossibly, diverging at angles that made no sense. One led toward darkness so thick it seemed to absorb the faint light of their lantern. The other wound in spirals, looping back toward where they had come, though Jonah knew the way back no longer existed. He tried the right-hand path, drawn by instinct, and felt the soil beneath his boots soften unnaturally. The roots stretched, twisting toward him like veins of the earth itself. Leaves whispered against each other above, murmurs almost forming words he couldn't understand. Mara stayed close, shivering, eyes fixed on the subtle movements of the forest. She stepped carefully, noticing that the ferns bent away as she passed, brushing against each other in frightened little swishes. Every plant, every tree seemed to be contracting from them, folding into itself to hide what lay beneath. Jonah's thoughts wavered. Memory slipped in tiny fragments. He thought he remembered a childhood fear of being watched in the woods, of being lost among indifferent trees. But this was different. These trees were not indifferent. They were terrified, and they did not want him here. The trail ended in a grove, barely noticeable at first, the ground sunken slightly in the center, roots forming a natural barrier around it. Here, the silence deepened, so thick that their own breathing sounded obscene. The trees leaned in strange arcs, pulling back from the center, forming a circle of recoiling giants. Jonah knelt and touched the soil. It was cool, unervingly smooth, as if it had been tended for centuries. A faint vibration ran beneath his palm, subtle, like a heartbeat from the depths. The forest held its breath. He looked up at Mara. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, reflecting the pale mist curling through the grove. "I don't think we should be here," she whispered. But the warning had already passed them by. Curiosity, perhaps the same hubris that had brought them here, kept Jonah rooted. He stepped into the center. The ground shivered faintly, not violently, but with deliberate subtlety. Roots shifted beneath his feet, leaves trembled violently overhead, and the trees leaned as far back as they could, branches arching like bent backs in fear. Jonah could feel the pulse beneath the soil, the slow, careful thrum of something ancient and patient, observing. A memory flickered. His father's voice warning him about places that remember. He hadn't understood then. He barely understood now. The forest was not malevolent. It was cautious, protective, and he had walked past its caution. He looked at Mara. She stood frozen, almost indistinct amid the swirling mist. They had ignored the forest's fear, the forest's warning. Now they were inside the circle, and there was nothing left to do but feel the quiet judgment pressing against them. The recoil of a living world that had bent back, leaving space for something buried, sacred, and unknowable. The wind began to stir, the first breath they had heard in hours. Not outside the forest, never outside. It came from below, vibrating through roots and soil, rustling leaves that had not moved for decades. Jonah felt an urge to flee, but the grove seemed to stretch outward, paths bending impossibly, loops returning them to this central point no matter where they stepped. Mara's hand gripped his. "We have to leave," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had an hour ago. The trees leaned back again, almost collapsing, as if exhaling. Their fear was a plea, a shield thrown over whatever lay beneath the soil. Jonah nodded, but he realized the forest had stopped warning. Its subtle signals had ended. It had done what it could. He didn't understand entirely what they had disturbed, only that it had been sacred, something that demanded its distance and respect. They retraced their steps, or what they thought were their steps. Pathways curving away, spiraling, bending. Shadows pressed close, distorted geometry looping in impossible ways. Leaves whispered, roots nudged. The forest remained in quiet terror, receding from them at every step. When they finally broke through the fog to a sun-dappled clearing, Jonah looked back. The trees appeared normal again, solid and indifferent, as though they had never moved at all. He tried to remember the path, to mark the trail, but it was gone from memory entirely. Only the sense of being unwelcome lingered, an itch beneath the skull. He would never forget the look of the recoiling forest, the subtle, deliberate fear that pressed against his mind. He would never forget the pulse beneath the soil, or the quiet insistence that some things in the world were meant to remain untouched, unseen. And somewhere deep within the old grove, the trees exhaled, resuming their vigil. They were not angry, they were afraid, and that fear had been the only warning Jonah and Mara had ever received. They had ignored it. Their tent glowed faintly from within, even when empty. At first, Mara thought she must be seeing things. The campfire had burned low to embers hours ago, its dying warmth leaving a thin chill that crept into her bones. The forest pressed against the darkness around them, massive and indifferent, each tree trunk a shadowed pillar under the faint sweep of the moon. She rubbed her eyes and blinked, trying to convince herself the soft amber light spilling from their tent was a trick of the firelight. But it was steady, humming faintly, almost breathing. "Jonah?" she called. Her voice cracked against the stillness, the syllables echoing softly in the empty woods. He didn't answer. She reached for her flashlight and flicked the switch. The beam wavered, sputtered, and then steadied, slicing a thin path through the mist that had begun to gather low across the ground. The tent's glow pulsed almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat beneath the taut nylon. Mara's fingers curled around the flashlight. "Jonah," she said again, louder, a tremor in her throat. "Are you in there?" There was no reply. The flap of the tent sagged in the occasional whisper of wind, moving as though it breathed, but the interior remained empty. Mara stepped closer. The fabric was slick with condensation, stiff in the chill, and yet warm in the lighted spots. She could feel heat radiating through the canvas, subtle but undeniable. She pressed her hand to the tent wall. The glow intensified, brightening against her palm, humming softly, almost inaudible but vibrating through her fingertips. A rustle of leaves came from beyond the circle of firelight, and Mara spun, shining the beam into the blackened trees. Nothing, only the rhythm of distant wind moving through pine needles, carrying the faint odor of damp earth. Jonah's voice came then, muffled, off somewhere past the trees. "Mara, you okay?" Relief twisted into suspicion as she squinted into the shadows. He emerged a few steps behind, a small flashlight swinging from his grip, illuminating his pale, tense face. You saw it too?" she asked, pointing at the tent. He frowned, hesitant. "I thought I was imagining it. The fire went out hours ago. There shouldn't be any light." He stepped closer, crouching to peer through the slightly open flap. "It's empty," he said, voice strained. "There's nothing in there." Mara's stomach nodded. "But it's glowing. I can feel it. Look at the nylon, warm, pulsing. Something's in there." Jonah shook his head, brushing damp strands of hair from his forehead. "There's nothing alive in the tent. It's probably just residual light from the fire, or—" He paused, noticing the consistency of the glow. "No," he said slowly. "It's too steady, too deliberate." The words left them both frozen in place, each listening to the forest in the uneasy hush that had descended. The night was alive in a way the day could never convey. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, seemed louder, deliberate. The ambient sounds were punctuated by subtle things they couldn't quite place. A branch scraping against another branch in a rhythm that mimicked breathing, the distant trickle of water that might have been the stream near their sight, or something moving beneath it. Jonah crouched closer to the tent, flashlight trembling. The glow was soft, warm, golden. Not like a lantern, not like any camp light they had brought. It shifted in intensity, ebbing slightly, as though aware of them standing there. He leaned in, and for a fraction of a second, he thought he saw a shadow inside. Not a human shadow, not even clearly humanoid, but a shape that seemed concentrated, waiting. Mara reached for the zipper, fingers stiff. "We need to see." "Stop," Jonah hissed. The sound of his own voice startled them both. The tent flared brighter in response, as though reacting, pulsating more strongly against their palms. The warmth surged through the nylon, through the fingertips pressed against it. They both jerked back. The glow dimmed, retreating to a low, steady hum again, almost like it was sighing. The campfire hissed as a last ember collapsed, sending sparks upward into the night. Shadows lengthened. Mara realized she couldn't remember when the fire had first died completely. Time here felt malleable, slipping past normal rhythm. Every glance toward the trees seemed to stretch and warp distances. 1 second Jonah was 2 steps away. The next he was 3, and then the blackness between them deepened like a mouth opening. "Maybe it's some kind of light from the phosphorescent moss?" Mara suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The memory of their hike didn't contain any moss patches like that, at least none they had noticed. Jonah shook his head. No, this isn't natural. It's... He trailed off, staring at the glow with a mixture of awe and growing fear. The tent seemed to pulse in response, slow, rhythmic, as though it were breathing. It's alive, maybe, he murmured finally. Or, something is inside. Inside what? Mara whispered. It's empty. We're alone. But Mara didn't feel alone. She felt watched from inside the glowing nylon, observed by something patient, something waiting. The sound of the forest around them, the distant owls, the rustle of small mammals, had vanished. Only wind through high branches moved now, and it carried an undertone of vibration, subtle, almost a resonance beneath her feet, as though the earth itself were in quiet suspense. Mara's flashlight flickered, sputtering briefly before steadying. Shadows quivered in the corners of her vision. She moved closer again, drawn toward the light despite every rational thought screaming to retreat. She peered into the tent, but there was nothing. No shapes, no distortion of the sleeping bags. Only the glow, steady, warm, and unervingly deliberate. Jonah touched her arm. Don't. It's testing us. Testing us? She asked, her voice barely audible. Her heart pounded. A strange sensation tickled her spine, as if the forest had contracted around their tiny campsite, holding them in a pocket of unnerving stillness. Yes, Jonah said, and his voice was tight, trembling with the edge of panic. Whatever it is, it knows we're here, and it wants us to notice. But, he gestured toward the tent, it doesn't want us to open it. We've been watching it, and it's waiting. The wind picked up suddenly, gusting through the trees in a low, mournful wail. The tent swayed slightly, fabric rubbing against fabric, and the glow brightened for a heartbeat. Mara felt a cold trickle run down her spine. She took a step back. The glow dimmed again, pulse slow and steady, almost as if it had been holding itself in check. Jonah knelt, trying to steady his breathing. Let's just leave it, he said finally. Go to sleep in the other tent, whatever we need to do. Just leave it alone. Mara wanted to argue, but the chill pressing into her chest made words impossible. She looked at the glowing tent and then at Jonah, who stared back, unblinking. The forest around them was a tapestry of darkness and soundless tension, each tree a silent sentinel. They moved to the second tent, the nylon rustling faintly as they entered, each step forward feeling weighted. Mara couldn't take her eyes off the glowing tent, and Jonah's hand brushed hers almost instinctively. Neither spoke. The night stretched. Shadows pooled. The faint light inside their original tent pulsed steadily, undisturbed, unwavering. Mara found herself imagining shapes within it, the impossible contortions of something waiting just beyond perception. Sleep was impossible. She kept imagining it, warm, patient, breathing, alive, just beyond the canvas. When morning finally came, the glow had vanished. Sunlight hit the forest floor in thin, fractured rays, the mist curling in lazy spirals. The campfire was cold ash. The forest seemed ordinary, indifferent. But Mara knew it wasn't. She knew what she had felt. And as they packed up and broke camp, she cast one last glance at the tent. Inside they had left nothing. And yet, the faint warmth lingered on the fabric, a memory of light that should not have existed, a pulse of awareness waiting for the next unwary traveler. Jonah glanced at her. It's gone, he said, but his eyes flicked toward the forest, toward the patch of empty ground where the tent had sat, as though the glow itself had migrated somewhere else, waiting. Mara nodded, saying nothing. She didn't need to. The forest had kept its secret, and the light had been its sentinel. And somewhere, deep within the night, it was still waiting.